Hello everyone. It's amazing to have you all participating in this event of the London Group of the Scientific and Medical Network. We've got people from all over the world. Welcome. And we are incredibly fortunate to have this evening Dr. Philip Goff, who is going to give us a talk on the topic of Is Consciousness Everywhere? Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. Last year, I came across his book, The Galileo's Era, and I was really taken by it. I read it almost in one sitting, and I wondered whether he would be willing to present to the London Group. And I was incredibly happy to hear that he was going to, and were it not for the lockdown, it would have been a regular meeting, which normally takes place physically here in my home. But with this lockdown, we have this opportunity to have all of you all over the world listening to this talk. Philip is a leading philosopher and consciousness researcher at the Durham University, and he's published a number of articles in various high-profile publications, and also an academic book on the topic, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality. And there is also an interesting dialogue between him and Philip Pullman of his Dark Materials on YouTube. So if you're interested, have a look at that. So tonight he will be explaining why he thinks that panpsychism is the best option for us to understand the nature of reality in which we live. So as Andrew said, we are going to switch off the chat option during his talk and then switch it on again for the questions after his talk. So I'd like now to pass the word on to Philip, thanking him very much for presenting this evening.
Brilliant. Thanks, Claudia, and thanks for the invitation and that very kind introduction. It's great to be able to do this. It's a shame I can't be there physically for obvious reasons, but it's great to be able to do this, and great. So thanks for so many people from many different places joining us. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Okay, so I have to use these things. So let me just. So if a tree falls in a forest and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? An age-old philosophical question, you might think. But in fact, this question was given a decisive answer in the 17th century by the father of modern science, so-called Galileo. And this is what I'd like to start talking to you about today. So a key moment in the scientific revolution was Galileo's declaration that mathematics was to be the language of the new science, that the new science was to have a purely quantitative vocabulary. So this is a much discussed moment. What's perhaps less discussed is the philosophical work Galileo had to do in order to get to that position. And that's because before Galileo, for thousands of years, following Aristotle, people thought that the world was filled with qualities. So people thought there were colors on the surfaces of objects and smells floating through the air and tastes actually inside food. But the problem was that you can't capture these kinds of qualities in the purely quantitative vocabulary of mathematics. You can't capture in an equation the spicy taste of paprika or the redness of a red experience. And so this was a challenge for Galileo's aspiration to exhaustively describe the physical world in mathematics, right? He wanted to exhaustively describe the physical world in mathematics, but these qualities got in the way. So what Galileo did was to propose a radically new philosophical theory of reality. And according to that theory, this was a philosophical theory, not something with observational support. According to this philosophical theory, the qualities are not really out there in the physical world, rather they are in the consciousness of the observer. So if you're looking at a tomato, for Galileo, the redness of the tomato isn't really out there on the surface of the tomato, rather it's in the consciousness of the person observing the tomato. Or if you're tasting paprika, the spiciness isn't really in the paprika, rather it's in the consciousness of the person eating it. Or to return to our starting example, if there's a huge tree crashing down in a forest, if there's no observer around, no observer, no consciousness, no sound. So Galileo, as it were, strips the physical world of its qualities, and after he'd done that, all that remained were the purely quantitative features, things like size, shape, location, motion, things that can be captured in mathematical geometry. So in Galileo's worldview, there is this radical divide between two domains: the quantitative domain of science, the physical world with its purely quantitative properties of size, shape, location, motion, things that can be captured in mathematics, and the qualitative domain of consciousness, consciousness with its qualities of colors and sounds and smells and tastes. So this was the start of mathematical physics, which has gone incredibly well. But I think what many people have forgotten is that it was never intended to be that physical science would be a total description of reality. The whole project was premised on putting consciousness outside of the domain of science. Okay, so why is this important? I think this has profound implications for the area I work in, namely the science and philosophy of consciousness. So I'd just like to start with just clearing up a bit of ambiguity about the word consciousness. It's a very ambiguous word. Often people use it to mean something quite sophisticated like self-consciousness, awareness of one's own existence. This is something we might be reluctant to ascribe to certain non-human animals. But the way I'm going to use it, and the way it's often used in these debates, it's something much simpler, in a way simpler, perhaps more complicated in other ways. It just means experience. Pleasure, pain, visual or auditory experiences. These are all forms of consciousness. So this is certainly something most of us would be happy to ascribe to many, many non-human animals. So maybe a sheep cannot reflect on its own existence, but it certainly has some kind of experience. It has visual, auditory experience of the world around it. If you are cruel enough to put a knife in a sheep, it's going to feel pain. So it has experience. I mean, Descartes thought non-human animals were simply mechanisms, but most of us think that they have experience. So that's really all we mean by consciousness. The difficulty, the challenge, is how we fit consciousness into our scientific worldview. Despite great progress in our scientific understanding of the brain, we still don't have even the beginnings of an explanation of how complicated electrochemical signaling might somehow be able to give rise to an inner subjective world of colors and sounds and smells and tastes that each of us knows every second of waking life. So it's broadly agreed that this is a deep problem. But one very common reaction is to say, okay, well, there's a problem here. We just need to a bit more neuroscience, a bit more cognitive science, our standard ways of investigating the brain, one day crack it. But one thing I'm keen to emphasize in my work is not just another scientific problem. There are many ways in which this is radically different to any other scientific problem, and indeed the standard scientific approach isn't entirely adequate to deal with it. And one very straightforward way of pressing that not so much what I talked about in the book really, but what I've pressed more recently, is just that consciousness is not publicly observable. You can't look inside somebody's head and see their feelings and experiences. We know that consciousness exists not from observation and experiment, but from our immediate awareness of our own feelings and experiences. Now science is used to dealing with unobservable entities. Fundamental particles like electrons and quarks cannot be directly observed. But there's an important difference. In the case of fundamental particles and other unobservables that science postulates, these things are, although they're unobservable, they're postulated in order to explain what we can observe. You know, fundamental particles are postulated as part of the standard model of particle physics, which, you know, an incredibly impressive theory that accounts for a wide range of observable phenomena. So still, you know, what we're trying to explain is data from observation. In the unique case of consciousness, the thing we are trying to explain is not publicly observable. And this just makes it, you know, absolutely unique and radically different to any other scientific problem. And I think this really constrains our capacity to deal with it experimentally, because it, you know, it doesn't show up in experiments. You can't do an experiment to see, you know, if something is conscious, if it has an inner life. Okay, but now that's not to say that we can't do anything experimental here. We do have a well-developed and robust science of consciousness. So how do we do it if consciousness is unobservable? Well, what we do is, although you can't observe consciousness, you can ask people about their private experiences. And if you do that while you're scanning their brain with EEG or fMRI scanner, you can map correlations between brain activity that we can observe and conscious experiences that we can't, but we can rely on people's testimony about. And so we can discover that, you know, a certain type of activity in the hypothalamus goes along with a feeling of hunger, say. And we can be more systematic than that. You know, we're now developing proposals about what in general, what kind of general brain activity is required for consciousness. One proposal, the integrated information theory of consciousness, proposes that consciousness is correlated with maximal integrated information in a system. And that's a notion that the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi gives a mathematically precise conception of. Okay, so this is very important data, these correlations that we can establish between brain activity and consciousness. And that's very important, but that's sort of but the problem is that is not in itself a complete theory of consciousness. Because what we will ultimately want from a theory of consciousness is an explanation of those correlations. Why is it that certain kinds of experience, or certain kinds of brain activity are correlated with certain kinds of experience? Suppose you accept the integrated information theory of consciousness. We still have the question, well, why is it that integrated information comes along with consciousness? Why should that be? And because consciousness is unobservable, that is not a question one can answer experimentally. So experimental work is very important. This is the upshot here, but it leaves open multiple options. What do? We can either pretend the problem doesn't exist, like lots of people do, or we can just put on the table these different options that the experimental work leaves open and try to decide between them on the basis of non-experimental considerations. So I don't think this is completely unknown and without parallel in science. I think it's a little bit like the situation in quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is one of our most successful scientific theories in terms of prediction. You know, so much of our modern technology is based on it. The problem is no one knows what the hell that theory is telling us about reality, right? You know, the equations work for predicting what's going to happen with certain high probabilities, but nobody knows what's going on in reality to make those equations work. And there are various interpretations. There's the Copenhagen interpretation, the many worlds interpretation, the Bohmian interpretation that I myself like. So what do? So, you know, some philosophers get frustrated. So some scientists get frustrated by this, and they say, well, if we can't answer it with an experiment, it's a stupid question, and just forget about it. And I like the podcast of the physicist Sean Carroll, who's talked a lot about how, you know, scientists who wanted to work on this issue couldn't get jobs, and, you know, it's only recently that's becoming a little bit less of a taboo topic. So, you know, I think what we've got to face up to, that there are some problems, that scientific questions that can't be straightforwardly answered with an experiment. And I think what we can do is put on the table the various options and try to decide amongst them on the basis of non-experimental considerations. And this is where I guess science meets with philosophy. So I think that's what we should do in the case of consciousness. I think the physicist Sean Carroll and many others would agree with me on that. But I also think it's what we need to do in the case of consciousness. The experimental work is very important, but it leaves so many options open that we need to go further. So what are the options on a theory of consciousness? Well, the two classic options are, on the one hand, materialism, and on the other hand, dualism. So dualism is roughly the view that consciousness is non-physical, outside of the workings of the physical body and brain. Materialism is roughly the view that consciousness can be explained in terms of the chemistry of the brain. And I guess I come to feel that both of these traditional options are incredibly problematic. And actually, when I was an undergraduate student at the end of the 90s, I just decided there was just no solution. It's because I was only taught these two options, and I thought they're both terrible. And so I wrote my end of study dissertation saying there's no solution to the problem of consciousness, and try to do something else and forget about it. But anyway, there's these huge debates here, but I'll just very briefly introduce you to the much discussed problems with each of you, and then we could maybe discuss more later. So the problem with dualism, I think, is more of a straightforward scientific problem, really, and it's that neuroscience doesn't seem to show any sign of the impact of an immaterial mind. Maybe some will disagree with me on this in the Q&A. So although dualists think the mind is distinct from the body and the brain, they think they stand in a close causal relationship. If the soul wants your arm to go up, then that will cause changes in the brain that will make the arm go up. Or as I'm speaking now, as my soul wants to express my thoughts, it makes changes in the brain and makes my lips move. So if there were an immaterial mind impacting on the brain every second of waking life, you'd think that would really show up in our neuroscience. There'd be all sorts of things happening in the brain that had all the time that had no physical explanation. I mean, maybe you think there is some evidence for paranormal phenomena, but is there evidence that all the time in a functioning brain there are many, many things that have no physical explanation? I'm not so sure. I mean, I just finished a popular article for BBC Future, some series, and here's a way I was trying to explain it and see what you think of this. For the dualist, the relationship between the soul and the body is a little bit like the relationship between a drone pilot and his drone, a hair drone. The drone pilot receives information from the sensors of the drone and controls it to a large extent. Similarly, for the dualist, the soul receives information from the brain and controls it. If you physically examined a drone, you'd be able to see where, a functioning drone, you'd be able to see the impact of the radio waves from the pilot impacting on the drone controlling it. Similarly, if there was an immaterial mind controlling the brain every second of waking life, you'd think that would be evident when we examine the brain. But that's not what we seem to find. So René Descartes, the most famous dualist historically, speculated that this happens in the pineal gland, which is a tiny pea-shaped gland in the brain towards the center of the brain between the two hemispheres. But it seems like modern neuroscience has shown that there isn't any such special place in the brain. And in fact, everything that happens in the brain seems to have a physical cause within the brain. So it's a bit like if we found something we thought was a drone, but then when we examined it, it seemed like everything it did was caused by physical processes within the drone itself. And if that were the case, we'd conclude it's not really a drone at all, it's a robot. And many people want to draw the same conclusion about the human brain. Okay, well, anyway, we can talk a lot more about that, I'm sure. What about materialism? So these kind of considerations move a lot of people to materialism. But I think the problem, well, here we come back to Galileo, right? And the problem is, since Galileo, physical science has worked with a purely quantitative vocabulary, whereas consciousness is an essentially qualitative, quality-involving phenomenon. If you think about the redness of a red experience, or the smell of coffee, or the taste of mint, you can't capture these kind of qualities in the purely quantitative vocabulary of physical science. And so as long as your description of the brain is framed in a purely quantitative vocabulary, you're always going to leave out these qualities, and hence leave out essentially consciousness itself. So I think the philosophical case against materialism is quite compelling, as more and more professional philosophers are appreciating. I think the reason materialism is as popular as it is because I think people have this idea that, look at the success of physical science in accounting for more and more of the universe we live in, creating incredible technology. Surely this ought to give us confidence that it'll one day explain consciousness, right? So we draw an inference, a sort of inductive inference from the great success of science to, okay, there's a deep problem with consciousness, but surely physical science, it's explained everything else, it'll one day explain this. But I think this is rooted in a certain misunderstanding of the history of science. Yes, physical science has been so successful, but it's been so successful precisely because Galileo designed it to exclude consciousness. If Galileo were to time travel to the present day and hear about this problem of explaining consciousness in physical science terms, he'd say, of course you can't do that. I designed physical science to deal with the quantitative, not the qualitative. And the fact that it's done incredibly well dealing with the quantitative since the qualitative was taken out doesn't give us any reason to think it's going to be able to apply itself to the qualitative reality of consciousness. So I think, that was probably an important move. Physical science has done incredibly well dealing with the quantitative mathematical features of matter. It's been very well since Galileo separated out the qualitative from the quantitative. I think if we now want, in contrast to to Galileo, if we now want to bring consciousness into the domain of science, we need to find a way of bringing those two things back together that Galileo separated, bringing back together the qualitative and the quantitative. Okay, so I think that's the problem, I guess. What I want to turn now to is what I think is the solution that avoids the problems with both of these traditional options. And it's rooted in very important work from the 1920s by philosopher and Nobel laureate Bertrand Russell and scientist Arthur Eddington, who's incidentally the first person to confirm Einstein's general theory of relativity after the First World War. So I'm inclined to think, as I said a number of times before, if anyone's watched any of the talks I've given before, I'm inclined to think these guys did in the 1920s for the science of consciousness what Darwin did in the 19th century for the science of life. And it's sort of a tragedy of history that it was forgotten about for so long for various historical reasons, like the Great Depression and the Second World War and the anti-philosophy zeitgeist, I think, of the post-war years, the latter half of the 20th century. But it's recently been rediscovered in academic philosophy and is causing a great deal of excitement. So this is partly why I wrote a popular book, to try and get these ideas out to a broad. Everything's so specialized these days, and something can be causing a lot of excitement in an area of academia and then no one elsewhere knows anything about it. Okay, so the starting point of Russell and Eddington is that physical science tells us a lot less than you might have thought about the nature of matter. So, in the popular mind, physical science is on its way to giving us this complete description of the nature of space and time and matter. But what Russell and Eddington realized, and I think is pretty uncontentious in philosophy of science these days, is that physical science is confined to telling us about how matter behaves, what it does. So let's look at some concrete examples from physics. So what does physics tell us about an electron? Physics tells us, for example, that it has mass and negative charge. How does physics characterize mass? Well, objects with mass are disposed to attract other objects with mass, that's gravitation, and to resist acceleration, that's gravity, sorry. How does physics characterize negative charge? Well, things with negative charge are disposed to repel other things with negative charge and attract other things with positive charge. Opposites attract, like charges repel. So this is all about behavior. This is all about what the electron does. Moving up the sciences, in chemistry, chemical elements, actually I'm covering my text here, chemical elements and compounds are characterized in terms of A, their causal relationships with other elements and compounds. For example, acids are defined in terms of their capacity to donate protons or hydrogen ions and to accept electrons. Or B, in terms of their physical constituents. So water is made up, as we all know, of molecules with 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 water atom. Oh, 1 water atom, sorry. 1 oxygen atom, of course, sorry. Then moving up to neurophysiology, brain states are characterized in terms of A, their causal relationships with other brain states or with bodily or behavioral states, or B, their chemical constituents. For example, neurotransmitters have a chemical nature defined in terms of their chemical composition. So all the way up and down the hierarchy of physical sciences, we're just learning about behavior. You know, that the high level sciences talk about behavior, or they defer to physics, and then physics, everything is cashed out in terms of behavior. Okay, so what's the problem? Well, this information is very useful. You know, if you have rich information about what matter does, you can manipulate the world in all sorts of extraordinary ways and produce incredible technology, the kind of technology that's transformed our planet. But if we merely know what an electron does, we only know about its relationships to other things, how it affects and is affected by other particles. We know nothing about how the electron is in and of itself, independent of other things. Nothing of what philosophers like to call the intrinsic nature of the electron. So here's a kind of chess pieces analogy. I used to talk about, every talk I've given before, I've talked about a single chess piece. It just occurred to me preparing this talk. It might be more illustrative to think about it, a lot of chess pieces. So you know, if you've got a load of chess pieces on a board, then you might be interested to know about the relationships between the chess pieces. You know, there's this black knight here is 3 spaces up and 1 space along from that castle, or rook, whatever the preferred term is. And that's important because in one move, if it's, depending whose turn it is, the knight could take the castle. Okay, so that's important information about how the pieces relate, how they can affect each other. But you might also want to know about what these chess pieces are in and of themselves. You know, what are they? Are they made of wood? Are they made of plastic? Are they made of metal? So that's the sort of intrinsic nature, how it is in itself. Similarly, when you get down to an electron, you might very well be interested in the information you get from physics about how particles interact and affect each other or related to each other, but you might also want to know, what is the electron in itself, independent of other particles? About this, physics has nothing to say. So this is sometimes called the problem of intrinsic natures. It looks like there's this huge hole in our standard scientific story of the universe. Physics gives us rich information about what matter does, but leaves us completely in the dark about its intrinsic nature. What's this got to do with consciousness? Well, the genius, I think, of Russell and Eddington was to bring together 2 problems that on the face of it have nothing to do with each other, and to see that they could be given a unified solution. On the one hand, the problem of consciousness, on the other hand, the problem of intrinsic natures. So the problem of consciousness is challenge of finding a place for consciousness in our scientific worldview. The problem of intrinsic natures is that we have this huge hole at the center of our scientific worldview. So the unified solution is plug the hole with consciousness, right? You're looking for a place for consciousness. You've got this huge hole. Let's try and put consciousness in the hole, see if it works. So the result is a kind of panpsychism. This is the ancient view that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world, that it pervades the universe and is a fundamental feature of it. But this is a kind of panpsychism that needn't be connected with any mystical or spiritual connotations, The basic idea is that there's just matter, particles and fields, perhaps nothing supernatural. But matter can be described from two perspectives. Physical science describes it, as it were, from the outside, tells us what it does, how bits of matter are related to other bits of matter. But matter from the inside, matter in terms of its intrinsic nature, is constituted of consciousness. So at the micro level, I have to change my text again. At the micro level, physical properties like mass and charge are characterized in terms of their behavior, what they do, but in their intrinsic nature on this view, they are incredibly simple forms of consciousness. We're not thinking of electrons feeling existential angst. This is just the simplest kind of experience you can imagine. I sometimes think it's useful to think, start with human experience is incredibly rich and complex. Experience of a horse, less so. Experience of a mice, less so. You keep going down, simpler and simpler forms of life. You seem to get simpler and simpler forms of experience. Do bed bugs have experience? If they do, they have incredibly simple forms of experience. There seems no natural limit to how simple experience might turn out. So in this view, electrons and quarks have some kind of experience, but of some incredibly simple form. Then moving up to the chemical level on this view, chemistry characterizes elements and compounds in terms of their behavior and their components, but in their intrinsic nature, they are complex forms of consciousness derived from the simpler forms of consciousness at the physical level. And then moving up to neuroscience, neuroscience characterizes brain states in terms of their behavior and their components, but in their intrinsic nature, brain states are complex forms of consciousness derived from the simpler forms of consciousness at more basic levels. So what this offers us is a beautifully simple, elegant way of bringing consciousness into our scientific story, of bringing together what we know about ourselves from the inside with what physical science tells us about the body and the brain from the outside. Okay, so that's all very well, but why should we think it's true? Well, as I've said, I think although experimental data is very important in science of consciousness, it leaves open many options. And what we have to do really is just lay out those options. We can either ignore the problem, we lay out those options and see whether a case can be made for one or some of the theories on the basis of non-experimental considerations. And I think when we do this with the two most conventional theories of consciousness, we find that panpsychism really wins hands down. And that's because it just avoids the deep problems associated with the more conventional options. So in contrast to materialism, Russell-Eddington panpsychism can accommodate both the quantitative features of matter and the qualitative reality of consciousness. So as we said, because physical science works with this purely quantitative vocabulary, inevitably a kind of physical science description of the brain will just leave out the qualities that essentially define consciousness. Whereas Russell-Eddington panpsychism can accommodate those qualities as the intrinsic nature of those brain states. And in contrast to dualism, Russell-Eddington panpsychism looks firmly consistent with our observational knowledge of the brain. And that's just because this is radically non-dualist theory. It's not that there's consciousness on the one hand and physical brain states on the other. On this view, there's just physical brain states. But in their intrinsic nature, physical brain states are forms of consciousness made up of simpler forms of consciousness. On this view, all there is consciousness. Physical science tells us how it behaves. As I sometimes like to put it, matter is what consciousness does on this view. So because it's non-dualistic, we don't have these worries of how consciousness impacts on the brain, because that already implies a dualistic separation. So it just avoids all these problems. So I like this line from, I was going to put this at the start of my book, and so a friend of mine said it was too cliched, and then I just forgot about it, and I wish I'd ignored them now. Anyway, this line from Holmes: once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. That's kind of how I feel about consciousness. I think we can rule out these more conventional options, and panpsychism is the thing that remains. Well, maybe you think there are other options. We could discuss that too. I mean, in a way, basically, I think materialism just doesn't account for the datum of consciousness. Dualism can, but in a way that looks problematic for more straightforward scientific reasons. Okay, but panpsychism is not without challenges of its own. The most famous is the notorious combination problem. The difficulty understanding the relationship between particle level consciousness and systems level consciousness. So, as I've already discussed, according to Russell Eddington panpsychism, the consciousness of humans and animals is somehow derived from the consciousness of particles, or more basic consciousness at more basic levels. And the combination problem, essentially, there's lots of different ways of cashing it out, but essentially just, how on earth does this happen? We can make sense of bricks making up a house or mechanical parts making up a car engine, but we are at a loss to understand how little conscious minds could kind of make up a big conscious mind. Some people think this is just kind of unintelligible. So this is a very serious charge, and much of the thought and energy of the contemporary panpsychist research program is based in trying to respond to this problem. So we're really getting into the sort of technicalities of the debate here. I just give you a flavor of some of the options. So broadly speaking, there are two approaches here: a reductionist approach and a non-reductionist approach. So the non-reductionist approach postulates fundamental laws of nature to bridge the gap from particle consciousness to systems level consciousness. So we just think there are just brute laws of nature according to which that, when you have conscious particles in a certain arrangement, you just get consciousness associated with the system as a whole. So the philosopher pictured here, Hedda Hasselmerk, has a very interesting version of this, and she's connected it with the integrated information theory we discussed earlier. So as I say, she spent a year in the lab of Giulio Tononi. So as I said, I think a neuroscientific theory like the integrated information theory just gives us a correlation. It says whenever you have maximal integrated information, you have consciousness. But then we need a philosopher or a philosophically inclined scientist to say, well, how do we explain that correlation? Hedda Hasselmerk says, well, we postulate a basic law of nature that consciousness appears at the level of a system where there is most integrated information. So it's a sort of philosophical interpretation of that scientific theory. This is what I really think we need to do, bringing the science and the philosophy together. Alternative, the reductionist option, is just to try and explain systems level consciousness just in terms of particle level consciousness alone, without recourse to these special laws of nature. So very interesting work on this is Luke Roloff's. Here's his very interesting book with Oxford University Press, Combining Minds, How to Think About Composite Subjectivity. And one of the interesting things he does is to think about this in the context of split brain patients. These are the I should plug in. Very interesting in case of people who've had the center of their brain severed, the corpus callosum connecting the two hemispheres of the brain. Is a very radical treatment for epilepsy, and it seems to lead to a kind of bizarre fragmentation of consciousness. It ends up looking like there's sort of two conscious minds in one head. So Luke Roloff's is interested in this because he thinks, this is kind of the reverse of mental combination. Mental combination, we're trying to make sense of multiple conscious minds unifying into a single conscious mind. In split brain cases, you start off with a single conscious mind and it seems to fragment into two distinct minds. So you think, we can sort of understand what's going on there and kind of reverse engineer it. That might give us an empirical grip on how to deal with mental combination. So this is what I think is fascinating. In all these cases, we're starting to get the science and the philosophy coming together to try and make progress here. I just want to give you a little flavor of my new view that I've been just working on recently. I'm writing a paper on at the moment. This goes beyond, what I didn't have this when I wrote the book, but working on a new view that combines two aspects. So the first is what I'm trying to do is kind of a hybrid view of the non-reductionist non-reductionism and the reductionism, according to which you have non-reductionism about systems level minds, but reductionism about consciousness. So the working out of this gets very technical, but just to have a metaphor to try and illustrate the point, if we think of a mind as a sort of container of consciousness, then on this view, we're non-reductionist about those containers, the special laws of nature that ensure that there are containers at the systems level as well as the particle level. But then what those containers are filled with is not new stuff, but the consciousness that already existed at the particle level. The systems level mind shares the experiences that already exist at the more basic level. So that's one aspect of it. But also I've returned to something I talked about in my first book, actually, a cosmopsychist view, according to which the most fundamental forms of consciousness are not in particles, but are the intrinsic nature of universe-wide fields. So panpsychism tends to be thought of in a sort of particle theory. We tend to think about particles as kind of Lego brick picture of the world, where you got the little bricks and you build it up, and you get bigger things. But actually, many physicists, rather than a kind of particle ontology, think in terms of fields. Like a field ontology seems, for many physicists, a more natural interpretation of physics, where the fundamental properties are actually universe-wide fields, and then particles are sort of excitations within those fields. So if we interpret panpsychism in those terms, then we're not thinking of the most fundamental consciousness at the level of particles, but we're thinking of the most fundamental forms of consciousness as the intrinsic nature of universe-wide fields. And in some ways, this dissolves some of the combination problem for us, because we're not starting with these little things and trying to build them up. We're starting with universe-wide fields and trying to abstract human and animal consciousness from them. And I think together with this hybrid view where we separate out the sort of containers of consciousness, I think this looks to be a way of spelling out panpsychism that avoids many of the challenges that have been raised to it. Anyway, I'm still thinking about that, but we could talk a little bit more about it if you like. Okay, well, I'll start to bring things together for the last five or 10 minutes. Give a little plug for my book, pictured here. So I have two books. My first book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, is very much an academic book. It's not incredibly accessible. It's ludicrously overpriced, as academic books always are, unfortunately. But this book is a very different kind of book. Is aimed at a general audience to try and get these ideas out there. So I guess just to sum up my position, I see it as a kind of middle way between the two standard options on consciousness. So, some people say consciousness is just so magical and mysterious, we'll never get a scientific grip on it. Other people say, the other extreme says, well, we just need to plug away with our standard forms of neuroscience and cognitive science and we'll be fine. I have a middle way approach that I think we can be confident that we will one day have a science of consciousness, but we need to rethink what science is. For 400 years, we've been working in a scientific paradigm that excludes consciousness. I have this provocative title, Galileo's error, but, maybe that was necessary so that we could just bracket the qualitative aspect of consciousness and just focus on the building mathematical models of the quantitative features of matter. It's all gone very well. But if science is to aspire to a complete theory of reality, that was never intended to be a complete theory of reality. It needs to work towards a theory able to account for both the quantitative data of physical science and the qualitative reality of consciousness. And in contrast to either materialism or dualism, Russell-Eddington panpsychism looks to be a framework able to do this. But but it's important to emphasize that this is not a finished theory of consciousness. It's really a research program, a very general framework for understanding how consciousness fits into the physical world. And it will take decades, centuries even, to fill it, of interdisciplinary labor between philosophers and physicists and neuroscientists to fill in those details. So you can compare it to Darwin's principle of natural selection. this is not a finished theory. It's a very general framework for understanding how life evolves, and then it took a century to get to DNA. The problem in this case is that Darwin came 100 years ago in the form of Russellianism, got forgotten about for a long time. Hopefully, I hope we can return to it. What this is essentially calling for is a new scientific revolution, or at least a radical rethink of the intellectual underpinnings of the first. And what's really great, and as I talk about in the book, is what we're now seeing is scientists and philosophers coming together to lay the foundations for this new approach. So I think it's very exciting. Well, I'd just like to finish. I just put together this slide a couple of hours ago. I'd like to finish really, I think, by saying why I think this matters. Actually, in my book, the first 4 chapters are building the scientific and philosophical case for panpsychism, but the 5th and final chapter explores its implications for human existence and the lives we lead. So, I mean, firstly, I think it's all that should be. It is missed apostrophe there. Apologies. I think it's intrinsically important to try and find out the ultimate nature of reality. Science isn't just about the practical issues of technology and building bridges and curing disease, as important as those things are, especially in our current situation. But it's also about the natural and noble human curiosity, the desire to understand the universe we live in. And I think the problem of consciousness, fundamentally is to be seen in that context. But I think the value of this, it goes beyond that, actually, because this isn't just some abstract scientific problem. Consciousness is at the root of human identity. Fundamentally, we relate to each other as creatures with feelings and experiences. Consciousness is arguably the basis of everything that's important in human existence. I believe our current worldview does not have a place for consciousness. Strictly speaking, is inconsistent with the reality of consciousness. And I think this can lead to a profound sense of alienation. I think we know that we have feelings and experiences, and yet our official picture of the universe, our official scientific worldview, tells us that all that's going on in our heads is complicated electrochemical signaling. And I think many people feel intuitively that's not quite the same thing. And moreover, I think there's strong philosophical support can be given to that intuition. So I think this is an important part of what's sometimes called the disenchantment of nature, this sense that we don't really fit into the universe somehow. Now, of course, I always emphasize when we're doing science and philosophy, we should be interested in not the view we'd like to be true, but the view that's most likely to be true. I think a very strong case can be made for the probable truth of panpsychism. But fortunately, I think it also offers us a picture of the universe in which we can sort of understand how we fit into it. And I think that's a picture of the universe that's a little bit better for our mental and spiritual well-being. I also discuss in the 5th chapter that panpsychism potentially offers a better relationship with the environment. If you think a tree is just a mechanism, then your conception of its value is going to be sort of indirect, just in terms of looking pretty or sustaining our existence, of course, more importantly. But if you think a tree is a conscious organism in its own right, albeit a very alien one, then it's a focus of moral significance in its own right. Chopping down a tree is an act of immediate moral significance. I think it is transformative to, if you're looking at these terrible forest fires we've had in Brazil, if you see that as the burning of conscious organisms, it adds an extra moral dimension. So I think this offers potentially a better interaction with the natural world. What about spirituality? There's often, in the public mind, connections with panpsychism and sort of mysticism. I'm always very keen to emphasize that there's not necessarily any connection here. So many of the people working on panpsychism in the contemporary context, like David Chalmers and Luke Roloff, who I mentioned earlier, are just complete atheists, secularists. I once asked David Chalmers if he had any religious or spiritual inclinations. He said only that the universe is cool. And I know Luke Roloff said he would be a materialist before he became a dualist. You know, these are people with very, very secularist worldviews. They don't believe in some transcendent spiritual reality, but they believe in consciousness. They believe in feelings and experiences that obviously exists, and so they want an explanation of that natural phenomenon, and that's why they turn to panpsychism. So there's no obvious connection here. There's no necessary connection, rather. But I suppose I do think that if for independent reasons you do have certain spiritual convictions, then panpsychism may be more consonant with those beliefs, more so than materialism, say. You know, if we think about mystical experiences, many people in all cultures have had these mystical experiences in which it seems to be revealed to them that there is some sort of universal consciousness underlying all things. If you're a materialist, you're going to have to think that's a delusion of some kind. You know, something funny's gone on in the brain, because, you know, the fundamental story of reality is just what you get from physics, and that's not talking about this universal consciousness. But if you're a panpsychist, you know, you already think that there is the fundamental nature of reality is constituted of consciousness, then it's less of a leap to take mystical experiences seriously, to suppose that what the mystic is discovering is some aspect of that fundamental conscious reality, some aspect of the intrinsic nature of universe-wide fields, if you like. So you don't have to go that way. Chalmers and Luke Roloff and many others don't want anything to do with that. And Chalmers sometimes gets a bit annoyed at me that I even talk about these things. But, you know, it's an interesting implication that it's more consonant with those type of views. If you know about Bayesian stuff, I guess I'd say this raises the prior probability of these kind of spiritual views, whilst not itself providing evidence for them. You'd have to have evidence on independent grounds, perhaps because you've had mystical experience yourself. So I talk about that a little bit in the book, and talk about, you know, whether in a sense this might account for a sense of life after death, or I discuss it in that context. Anyhow, okay, so yeah, in summary, I think panpsychism offers not only a way of addressing one of the deepest, most profound challenges of modern science, but it also offers the potential to transform in a positive way our understanding of what it means to be a human being. And so for both these reasons, I think it's a view we should at least take very seriously indeed. Thank you very much. Look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was really, really interesting. Very, very interesting. So I'd like to start by asking you a question, and by focusing on what you said just at this last minute regarding the last item of why it matters. Your approach is kind of bottom up, so consciousness of particles, and then building up to consciousness of the sophistication level of human beings, going through nature, plants, trees, animals, and so on. In which case, I assume that you would be okay with thinking that consciousness more sophisticated than human consciousness must exist. Or are we the most sophisticated consciousness in the universe, which sounds somewhat arrogant, really. So if there are more sophisticated manifestations of consciousness, would you entertain the idea that in terms of sophistication, it becomes more and more and more complex, up to a level of the highest complexity possible? And would you entertain the idea that this is perhaps what the spiritual traditions have called God, the One, the highest consciousness, and all of those words? And if so, would you entertain the idea that it could actually be a top-down process for the manifestation of consciousness that we experience as human beings?
Thanks, Claudia. That's a really, really interesting question. So yeah, I mean, you're right. In my book, Galileo's Error, I was mainly dealing with this kind of bottom-up picture, but actually, in my first book, and what I'm sort of coming back to a little bit now is actually what kind of connected what you just said, this cosmopsychist view, this top-down view, where actually the fundamental things are universe-wide fields. I mean, for no one reason is that seems to fit better with modern physics, but I think it helps dealing with certain problems of panpsychism. So this is a kind of view where, yes, the fundamental conscious mind is something, is the universe rather than something at the micro level. The philosopher Jonathan Schaffer's spent a lot of the last 10 or 15 years working out in quite detail. He's not a panpsychist. He doesn't not interested in that kind of stuff, but working out the details of this kind of view where it's actually the universe is the fundamental thing rather than little particles, and arguing there's certain advantages to this view and it fits better with science and so on. But then there's another step to get to something like God. I think you'd need another step there, because I mean, as I talk in my first book, okay, just because you have the universe being conscious, it doesn't mean it's intelligent or a rational agent in any sense. I mean, you might think to get something like that, you need millions of years of evolution by natural selection, and so that you might think actually biological organisms are the highest forms of consciousness because they're the only ones who've been subject to millions of years of natural selection that's molded these simple forms of consciousness into complex forms of consciousness. So I imagine that's what David Chalmers and Luke Roelofs would think, that even though they're open to the idea of the universe as consciousness, as I put it in my first book, the consciousness of the universe might be just a kind of mess, just this sort of blobby mess. It's not like it's not like a thinking, sophisticated, rational thing. It's just a kind of mess, and be good. So that's one option. Now you need what I have discussed at certain points, though. I have an article, Did the Universe Design Itself? And I have a popular version of this with Eon. Suppose you had independent reasons to believe in something like God. Maybe you take the argument from fine-tuning or some of the other traditional arguments for God seriously. Then you could combine that in a panpsychist view to get the view that's called pantheism, where instead of thinking of a supernatural God, you think of the God being the universe, the intrinsic nature of the conscious universe. So that's a view I've explored, and I think there might be some advantages to. If I'm going to believe in God, I'd rather think of God in those terms rather than a supernatural. I'm actually applying with another academic for a Templeton grant on pantheism and panpsychism and panentheism, a project. So I'm open to that. I mean, I'm kind of agnostic. I'm a sort of, well, I'm an agnostic. I'm probably much more open to these kind of spiritual things than some of my panpsychist brethren, fellow panpsychists. I shouldn't use the word brethren, so the sexist term, isn't it? But I was thinking of David Chalmers and Luke Roelofs. But I know Hedda Hassel-Merck is what's the word? A pan. It sounds a bit like panda. She has the view that the universe used to be God, but God has died and no longer exists. So I can't remember what she calls this, pandeism or something. Oh yeah, pandeism, because like deism, but pantheism. Anyway, so I certainly think. I mean, it's part of the point really that I always want to emphasize that there's no necessary connection between panpsychism and anything spiritual, but at the same time, I think this provides a fresh and interesting way to engage with spiritual considerations if, for independent reasons, you take those kind of things seriously, perhaps because of arguments or just because of, you take mystical experiences as a source of information about reality.
Exactly. And the supernatural is only the natural for which we don't have an explanation yet. But anyway, thank you very much, Philip. Let's open to questions from other people.
So how do I get the chat now? Okay, so starting with Michael Lingard. Oh, sorry, I've expanded it and I've lost where I'm up to now. Sorry, first time I'm answering questions in this manner. I've lost Michael now. Oh, here we go. A learning universe where we all contribute along with animals, plants, minerals, atoms to the universal consciousness. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that connects again. Panpsychism doesn't necessarily come along with a universal consciousness, although I think there are versions where it does. But even when it does come along with the universal consciousness, it needn't necessarily think of that as a sort of intelligent being like a god or something. But there are very interesting versions. I mean, versions associated with Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, who people always tell me off for not talking enough about, and process theism that followed Whitehead, I think is really interesting views there. Thomas J. Ord is a contemporary Christian philosopher actually who's interested in these kind of panentheistic conceptions of God, and Teilhard de Chardin also. I think there are certainly ways of spelling out panpsychism in these terms. If you define consciousness as experience, how do you describe the experience of an electron? Simon asks. Very good question. There's a good paper by Pad Lutus called "What's It Like to Be a Quark?" So I mean, the first thing to say is, I mean, panpsychism is a very general framework, and it, as I said, it will take time to fill in some of these details. One thing to say, if we spell this out in a cosmopsychist version, then it's not necessarily the case that particles have consciousness. We might be asking, what is the consciousness of these universal wide fields? Okay, but so will we ever be able to shed light on what it's like to be an electron? Let's suppose we're thinking of electrons as conscious. Well, I think we can certainly say something about the structure of its consciousness. We know about the kind of properties. We know about the structure of an electron, the number of properties it has, and so we can infer on that basis the structure of its consciousness. Will we ever be able to fill in more detail than that? I'm kind of cautiously pessimistic about that, partly because, I mean, these are going to be just so simple that I don't think we could even entertain such simplicity. You think of your simplest experience like just seeing red or something. That's already a very rich structured experience with sort of hue and saturation and brightness, and it's probable that we can't even get a grip on those. And I think independent reason, I mean, this is part of the challenge to any science of consciousness, that as Thomas Nagel famously put out his classic paper from the 70s, what's it like to be a bat? Consciousness is essentially subjective, and you can only fully understand the consciousness of another human being by adopting its perspective. And Nagel said, we can't adopt the perspective of a bat that echolocates, and so in some sense we'll never really know what it's like to be a bat. In that sense, we'll never really fully understand its conscious experience. So I think it might be that we can never fill in all these details of the qualitative character of the experience of other creatures, even organisms that we all agree are conscious, never mind particles. But I still think we can say something about the structure, and we can say something about how the structure of human experience and the experience of organisms is derived from these more basic structures. And we can still have a picture of the world where we can make sense of how consciousness fits in, how human consciousness is derived from these more fundamental forms of consciousness, even if we can't fill in all of the details. But I mean, maybe we can. It's early days. I mean, I think we have reason to take this view seriously, even if it ends up we can't fill in all of the details. Okay, so I hope that partly answers the question. Okay, Dr. Steve Manette. Recognize that name, don't I? Can you say more about how a universal field, cosmopsychism, can better explain consciousness than particle consciousness? Okay, so I mean, there are issues. I've forgotten my views now. There are issues to do with unity. One of the deep difficulties. There's lots of different. What's called the combination problem. There are lots of different aspects to it. David Chalmers has this long paper called "The Combination Problem for Panpsychism," and there's lots of different versions. One is an issue about unity. Consciousness seems to exhibit a deeper unity. In some sense, it's intuitive to think that the whole consciousness is, in some sense, prior to its parts. It doesn't seem like conscious experience is just sort of built up from little bits. It doesn't seem like it's built up like you build up a house from little bricks. And also there's another related problem is about what's sometimes called a structural mismatch problem, that the structure of human consciousness doesn't seem analogous to the structure of the human brain. What we know from neuroscience is that human consciousness seems to be correlated to pretty high level information structures in the brain. If you have an integrated information theory, or the other leading rival, global workspace theory, where consciousness is associated with information that's, as it were, broadcast throughout the brain, that's available to many different systems in the brain. This is all at quite a high level of abstraction. It's not really, it abstracts from specific neurophysiological details like calcium chambers and action potentials and neuronal firings. It's sort of more high level than that, never mind subatomic structures. So if you're a panpsychist, right, if you think my consciousness is to be explained in terms of particles, then why don't particle level structures show up in my consciousness? They sort of seem irrelevant. My consciousness seems associated with high level structures. So my thought is, well, what we do is we start off with the consciousness of the universe-wide fields, incredibly complex, busy consciousness, termed by the kind of structure of its, what we call particles, excitations in the field. And human and animal consciousness is a sort of a partial, thinned out form of that. And then we've got the question, what does the thinning out? And that's where the other aspect of my view comes in, that we're non-reductionist about the sort of containers of consciousness, the minds. So they share so if you think of the consciousness of the universe-wide field as an incredibly rich, busy pattern, and then what the human has, or the animal has, is some of that pattern. It sort of abstracts out some of that pattern. That's kind of the view I'm going at. That I'm going to talk about this Friday at a graduate conference at York, but that's roughly the idea, that we can get around some of these structure problems. Hope that helps a little bit. Keep these going quicker. SM membership includes Erwin Laszlo, who has described the Akashic records. If you're familiar with the concept, I don't know about the Akashic records. Sorry, I should probably look it up. If you can, I'll look it up. Hi, Philip. Okay, so that was Michael. Martin Earl, would you agree that even if you're right, we would not be any further in understanding what consciousness intrinsically is? What is it that is experiencing something? Well, I don't. So often the problem of consciousness is put as the problem, we don't know what consciousness is. Consciousness is a mystery. I don't like that way of putting it, because I don't think consciousness is a mystery. I think in a way nothing is more evident than what pain. We're just talking about things like pain. I think you know what pain is when you feel it. Pain just is, by definition, a kind of feeling, and when you feel it, you know how it feels, and that's all it is. So I would say the problem is not what is how consciousness fits into reality, but no, I do think consciousness, panpsychism gives us, in broad brushstrokes at least, a way of understanding how consciousness fits into reality in a way that's scientifically credible and free of other problems. So I do think that this makes considerable progress. of course, there are more details to be worked out. What is it that is experiencing something? That's a very good and deep question. Well, on this, oh, I got the gallery view. That's good. Nice. Wow, seeing lots of people. Suddenly the gallery views appeared. So there are different options here. I mean, some people think that the thing that's having the experiencing is just a bundle. David Hume had something like this: a bundle of experiences put together. Some people think no, you need the experiences and the thing that has the experiences. As I said, my new view very much requires the latter view, that there's the thing that has the experience, the bearer of the experience, what's often called a subjective experience, and the experiences are something in some way separate, although you can't kind of pull them apart. But what is the thing that, I don't know. I mean, I guess I just think we understand what that is as well. I think it's just a thing that experiences. I'm not sure we need to say there's more to its nature than it being a thing that experiences. It's like, what is a feeling? Well, it's defined by how it feels. What is a feeler? Well, it's something that feels. I'm not sure. I mean, of course, there might be more to its nature than that, but I guess I'm not completely convinced there is a deep mystery as to how we understand the thing that is having the experiencing, but I'm open to persuasion. Okay, Richard Galt. Why retain any belief in material? Science does seem to say deep down there's nothing material there. And maybe attracted to people like Bernardo Kastrup, idealist, or Donald Hoffman. I suppose you mean Donald Hoffman at a big consciousness conference in April, but unfortunately that's all cancelled. But I'm actually debating Bernardo Kastrup this weekend at the How the Light Gets In festival, which has gone online. So we're going to be discussing the difference between our two views. I suppose in general, I need to catch up on his work before the debate, but I think in my view is a middle way between idealism, which is the view that at the fundamental level is just consciousness. Maybe the physical world is an illusion or a construct out of consciousness. And then the materialist view, I think mine is a middle way. I mean, I want to say the materialist is completely right about the structure of the physical world. So physical science gets the structure right, but that structure is infused with consciousness. So there's, that's not the complete story. But I like that I can stay closer to the scientific story in that respect, because I guess when we get to the pure idealist view, well, it depends how you spell it out. I need to think more about Bernardo's view, but I mean, one classic problem with idealists is, how do we make sense of the regularity and uniformity of experience when we all look in the same direction, we all see a table. What accounts for that regularity? George Berkeley, the classic idealist from the 18th century rather, postulated God. He thought God is constantly looking at the table and ensuring you haven't experienced the table. I think that whether or not God exists, that kind of continuously intervening God is a bit inelegant. I like the materialist answer. There's a table there, and that's why we all see a table, because there's a table there and light bounces off it and hits your eyes. And so, I want to buy into all that, except they don't have a place for consciousness. So I want to buy into all that, but add consciousness as what infuses the structure that they point to. I guess you're pointing to that there's nothing material down there. Well, there's, they still talk about particles or fields. Yeah, they're not the sort of billiard balls we got in the 19th century physics, but there's a mathematical structure there. I like the Bohmian view where there's a wave function and there are particles. So is there a bridge between forms of consciousness speaking of Platonic forms? Very interesting. I think I'm actually a Platonist as well. And I think I'd like to maybe talk about Platonism a little bit in my next book. Not obviously that. I guess what I meant by forms of consciousness there was something much more mundane, which was just in the sense that, circularity is a form of shape. There's the general property of shape, and then that comes in various forms. Squareness, triangularity, circularity, and so on. Colors come in various forms. So I just meant it in that mundane sense, that there's the general property of consciousness, and then there's various forms of it. So I don't think that had any obvious connection to Platonic forms, but I am very much, I'm interested in, I am a Platonist because of, I think we're going through a phase of history where we're blown away by the success of physical science, and that leads us to think, oh, that's the complete story of everything. I'm going to be pressing this a lot in this festival at the weekend, but in my view, the reason physical science has gone so well is because it was aimed at a quite focused, limited task, roughly mathematical models to describe the behavior of matter. And there's lots of things we know to be real that don't fit into that. In my Galileo's error book, I focus on consciousness, but I think another thing is numbers and sets, the kind of entities that mathematicians deal with. This is not even anything spiritual or controversial. Most mathematicians are Platonists. They believe the things they're studying are discoveries about numbers and sets. And so that, the most straightforward view is that there, as well as the spatio-temporal world, there is the mathematical realm. I also a strong moral realist. I do believe in facts about morality that I would like to think of as relationships between Platonic forms. So I like to think of, so what grounds the fact that, very roughly, pain is bad, that there's a relationship between the Platonic universals of suffering and the Platonic universal of badness. So not necessarily connected to panpsychism, although obviously all these things have somehow got to fit together in a unified worldview, and that's something I'd like to think more about. Very nice stuff, thank you. May I ask two questions? Would you exclude the possibility of some kind of mathematics describing the intrinsic natures? There is compelling evidence that intention affects matter. How would this fit into your approach? The Global Consciousness Project. Check that out. So Vasilios asks, would I exclude the possibility of some kind of mathematics? I suppose I would. By definition, I would, I suppose, that intrinsic nature is defined as what goes beyond what can be captured in mathematics and causal terms. The other question is, why think there is anything that goes beyond what can be captured in mathematical or causal terms? And at that point, I think panpsychists tend to say two things. One, there are certain arguments, going back to Bertrand Russell himself, that try to show that if we don't have intrinsic natures, we get in a kind of vicious circularity, because everything, if things are just defined in terms of their relationships, everything ends up being defined in terms of everything else. So you say, what's mass? And you say, if you're just trying to work out what things are from the equations of physics, say, what's mass? You say, well, mass causes gravitational attraction. You say, okay, well, what's gravitational attraction? You say, well, it's, when a force that reduces the distance between things. You say, well, what's distance? If you really don't know what any of these things are, apart from what you can learn from the equations of physics, you might say distance is, and you give further equations that are related to other physical properties, including mass. So you kind of go around in a circle, and nothing ends up getting properly defined. I have a popular article on this called "Do Electrons Dream of Electric Sheep?" with the forum. They edited and they gave it that name. I didn't comment. So yeah, I imagine this example where someone's got 3 matchboxes, and they say there's a blurge, a splurge, and a curge in the 3 matchboxes. And you go, what's a blurge? And they say, oh, it's a thing that makes splurges. You say, okay, well, I don't understand what that means. So I know what a splurge is. What's a splurge? And you say, oh, it's a thing that makes curges. You say, okay, well, what's a curge? And you say, oh, it's a thing that makes blurges. and you just go around in a circle and you don't know what the hell is in the matchboxes. I think basically if you're just going off physics, that's the kind of situation we have. It's very useful, but you can't get an adequate definition of everything because everything's interdefined. That's the problem. Everything's. But even if those arguments don't work, suppose those arguments don't work, I still think there's reason to postulate intrinsic natures because it gives us this cool theory of consciousness that avoids the deep difficulties that plague the other theories. So I think that in itself is a reason to go for it. Compelling evidence that intention affects matter. Well, I suppose I'd want more details. That I mean, it's clear in some sense that intention affects matter, because if I intend to go for a walk, my legs are going to start to walk. So I mean, everyone agrees that intention affects matter, and I mean, a panpsychist doesn't have a problem with that because intentions are the part of the intrinsic nature of matter. So they're part of the physical world. This is why it's a radically non-dualist theory. People always think of panpsychism as a kind of dualism. You think that the particle has its physical properties like mass, spin, and charge, and its consciousness properties. But that would get into all the problems of dualism. And so the physicist Sabine Hossenfelder has this blog post that got a lot of views, making this objection to panpsychism, saying, well, there's no sign in physics of these consciousness properties, so they probably don't exist. But that's give it a dualistic interpretation of panpsychism. The view is not that there are the physical properties and the consciousness properties. The view is that the physical properties, like mass, spin, and charge, are forms of consciousness. So, but maybe you're talking about something different, intention affecting matter, like something more sort of telepathic or something. And I'm not sure. This is evident. Probably I should look more into the evidence for these kind of things. I tend to think of my job as a philosopher as providing a neutral framework that is open to whatever the empirical evidence shows. So if the empirical evidence shows there's some psi phenomena, my theory can accommodate that. If the empirical evidence shows there isn't psi phenomena, then it can accommodate that. It's not my area of expertise. So I'm interested in, Rupert Sheldrake. I'm friends with Rupert Sheldrake, but I sort of feel it's, obviously he's going against the grain on empirical science. Maybe many of you are sympathetic with that, but I sort of feel like it's outside of my area of expertise to assess these arguments, although I probably should look more into it. What does all that say about the fundamental nature of the individual? Does the soul exist? So I don't think the soul exists because I'm a panpsychist rather than a dualist. What about the fundamental nature of the individual? I mean, there are lots of difficult issues about how we make sense of what it is for an individual to continue over time. The panpsychist Galen Strawson, who was incidentally my PhD supervisor, he thinks selves only last a few seconds. So your human life is made up of trillions and trillions of selves that just last a few seconds. So he thinks individuals don't last a few seconds. Other panpsychists, like Luke Roloff, who I mentioned earlier, might have a view that many materialists share from John Locke, that what makes the person over time is something like psychological continuity, that you have the same memories, that you have the same character. It's those personality traits, those memories that constitute the person's identity over time. The late philosopher Derek Parfit had really interesting stuff to say on this. Others, maybe emergentist panpsychists like Hedda Hasse-Merck or Gerhard Bruntrup, that's closer to dualism because you have a sort of fundamental individual that comes into existence dependent on micro-level particles perhaps, or the whole universe, but it's a fundamental individual. So in that sense, it's closer to dualism because there's a fundamental individual that at least lasts from birth to death, or maybe lasts throughout the day. I had a long period when I used to think the self only lasts till you go to sleep and you're a new self the next day. It really worried my wife that I was you're dying every day. Anyway, so I'm open to all these possibilities. Panpsychism, I mean, dualism makes a difference, I suppose, if you do believe there's an immaterial soul. Although, dualists like David Chalmers they don't think the immaterial mind survives death. Martina Niederrümelin is a very good dualist, but she wants to say it as just a purely natural phenomenon. So just because you're a dualist, it doesn't mean that the soul survives death or something. So I think I'm afraid to say probably all of these options are left open, and I'm very yeah. Sorry, that's not very helpful, but that's probably the reality of it. How could you conduct? But I mean, I do talk about in the final chapter this: if you take certain mystical experiences seriously, how that might lead to some kind of non-individual life after death, in a sense. How could you conduct a test experiment for panpsychism? One outcome could disprove it, the other outcome would leave it standing, from Gerben. Okay, so this comes back to, this is a very, very common question I get, and this comes back to the issue that, I think experimental, because consciousness is unobservable, is not publicly observable, at least. Maybe in some sense you can observe your consciousness, but it's not publicly observable. You can't look inside someone's brain and have the philosopher Daniel Dennett is wonderfully consistent on this. He thinks consciousness is not publicly observable, so it doesn't exist, at least there's the only data for consciousness for him. It depends what you mean by consciousness. He goes a bit back and forth, but the only data for consciousness are what's publicly observable. So I think because of this a lot of options are left open. So I think materialism and dualism, materialism and panpsychism, and a certain kind of dualism, what's called epiphenomenalist dualism, the view that consciousness doesn't actually do anything. So those three views are just empirically indiscernible, in the sense that they make exactly the same predictions. So I just think that you can't tell between them with an experiment, sadly. And as I say, I think this is like the situation in quantum mechanics, where there's the many worlds theory, the Bohmian theory, the Copenhagen interpretation. They are empirically equivalent, and so what can we do? It would be nice if we could have an experiment, but I think that not all questions are an experiment. I think this is. It is a main case where a lot of history, you can't answer with an experiment. It's empirical evidence, but you can't set up a test to see whether, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Is it Caesar crossed the Rubicon? I can't remember. I think there are not all questions can be answered. So I don't think there is a test that can be. I have a public exchange of letters with Massimo Pigliuccio where we discuss this at length. He's just saying, well, it's a load of nonsense then. But I think, okay, you could say, okay, if an experiment can't settle it, then we can't have a view on it. But then I think you should say, and this is what I think I couldn't get Massimo to accept, I think you should say, not that I'm a materialist, you should say, well, I don't know. You should say, I don't know whether materialism or panpsychism or epiphenomenalism dualism is true. You should be agnostic. But I think that there are ways which we can not experimentally decide between theories. There definitely are standard scientific ways in which we decide between theories other than through experimental basis. Most obviously just because of simplicity. There's, for any empirical data, there are an infinite number of theories compatible with that data. So what do? We decide between them on the basis of considerations of simplicity. We go for the simpler one. Usually it's kind of obvious what the simpler is, but there are times in the history of science where it's made a real difference. Most notably, Einstein's special theory of relativity, which is empirically equivalent to the Lorentzian theory that preceded it. I had a big Twitter argument on this recently with the editor of the British Journal of Philosophy of Science. But we weren't disputing, I don't think, that key point of empirical indiscernibility. But the scientific community universally went with Einstein's theory because it just gave a much simpler interpretation of the data. Likewise, probably the most popular interpretation of quantum mechanics for philosophers of physics, I don't know about physicists, but philosophers of physics, is many worlds interpretation, because people think it's kind of extravagant that you've got all these worlds. It's actually in a sense the simplest interpretation of the view, because you've just got the Schrödinger. You don't have any collapse of the wave function. In all other interpretations of not all, in other interpretations mechanics like the Copenhagen interpretation, you've got collapse of the wave function. So you've got this weird thing that the Schrodinger's cat thing, that you're not looking in the box, it's alive and dead. You open the box, the wave function collapse. You either get a definitely dead cat or definitely live cat. That's really weird. But with the many worlds interpretation, you don't get collapse. You just, all the possibilities exist. So we do, I think, have ways of deciding between theories not just on the basis of experimental considerations. And I think this is part of the kind of fetishization of science. This kind of because a certain method is done so well in a particular context, doesn't mean it's the appropriate method in all cases. But anyway, I've said enough, I think. Thank you very much. Oh, I see this question coming up again, but it's the same question. Maybe I missed out Gerben before, sorry about that. If everything has consciousness, what does that say about life? Is everything alive in the same way from an electron to the planet? That's from Don McGregor, thank you very much. So I guess it depends what you mean by life, perhaps. I mean, one way of thinking about, if we just think of life sort of functionally defined in terms of behavior, it's a difficult question how you define life, actually. Well, there's the definition you learn at school, where it's sort of, what are the 7 characteristics of digestion and metabolism? And if we just give these kind of behavioral characterizations of life, then I would certainly say it's not the case that everything's alive, because these are just behavioral things that arise in more sophisticated matter that's evolved. So I wouldn't say everything's alive. Although I'm interested, there are certain panpsychist views, again, coming back to Whitehead, he called his view, organicism, organic realism, where we do think of the universe as a kind of organism. Again, just because you're a panpsychist doesn't mean you think the universe is conscious. Even if you think the universe is conscious, doesn't mean you think it's like an organism. But there are some interpretations of panpsychism where you can think of it might be appropriate to think of the universe as something closer to an organism. You might just think it's a more appropriate metaphor in the context of panpsychism. I think metaphors are important, and probably the metaphor from the scientific revolution was as a mechanism. The universe like a clock. Maybe in a panpsychist worldview, it's more natural to think of it as some kind of organism, and a more organicist conception of the universe. Very interesting. Maybe something I need to think a little bit more about. Okay, Marcella, isn't it too drastic or hard to emphasize that a worldview has no place for consciousness, since we are part of it and everything is part of it? Sophie, emphasize that. Well, so I suppose my view is, and this is a controversial view, of course. My view is that our official scientific worldview, which I think is materialistic, is, strictly speaking, inconsistent with the reality of consciousness. Because I think that worldview tells us that, at the basic level, there is just matter, the physical facts that can be captured in the purely quantitative reality of physical science, in the human brain, that's the entire nature of the brain can be captured in the purely quantitative language of physical science. And I think that it just is to say that there are no qualities, that is to deny the reality of the qualities we know in experience, the blueness of a blue experience, the feel of cold ice. I think these things can't be captured in a purely quantitative vocabulary. So if all there was to reality was a quantitative nature, then sort of by definition, there wouldn't be any qualities. So I think our official worldview denies the existence of consciousness. Now, of course, consciousness still exists. So that's why I think our official worldview is false, right? If you want to put in a logical argument, it's like, if materialism were true, consciousness wouldn't exist, but it does exist, so materialism is false. A little bit like some people argue against the existence of God with the problem of evil. I'm not advocating this argument, but or saying it's just as an analogy, you might say, if God existed, there wouldn't be terrible suffering. There is terrible suffering, therefore God doesn't exist. That's one argument that people put against God. So I guess I'm not saying that argument is right or wrong. I'm just saying a similar structure to my argument against materialism. I think if materialism is true, consciousness wouldn't exist. It does exist, therefore materialism is false. Now, it's not that most materialists think consciousness doesn't exist. There are radical materialists like Daniel Dennett in some moods, or Keith Frankish is much more explicit about this. There's a lot of interesting discussion. There's an interesting paper by one of these people. This is called illusionists, the people who think, so Keith Frankish and I talk about him in my book. He's a very good friend of mine. We both agree that you can't explain consciousness in conventional scientific terms. I draw from that the inference that we need to expand our conception of science. He draws from that the inference that consciousness doesn't exist. It's just kind of like fairy dust, magic. It's sort of fiction. So there's an interesting paper by one of these illusionists discussing the moral implications. How do we think about morality if we think pain doesn't exist? In a certain sense, at least. So I'm objecting to our, and I just think that's important, because I think it does give a sense of alienation that we know. So the thing that's most obvious and is so important, everything that's important about life is to do with feelings and experiences, and our official worldview says that doesn't exist. This is not to do with anything. This is not even to do with spirituality or anything. This is just about pain and pleasure. Anyway, so I think it's important. Okay, Degard says, have you involved any of the theories of natural inclusion? Dr. Alan Rayner, for example. No, but I'll make a note of it. Thank you very much. Sorry if I'm ignorant of certain areas. I tend to get quite focused on, as I say, people are always shouting at me for not talking about white-headed enough. Sue Van Coller, how would it change your feeling about trees, for example, if you knew the ultimate nature of reality? Well, as I say, I think panpsychism does. Well, actually, I mean, it's controversial whether trees are conscious on panpsychism. I'm inclined to think that they are, and I think that does radically change your picture of things. How would it change? I mean, I guess I think the ultimate nature of reality is consciousness involving, and so that fits with my view about trees as having their own conscious life that's somehow derived from that. So I'm not quite sure what you mean, the ultimate nature of it. If I discovered, I mean, maybe you're expressing belief in some kind of, there is some underlying spiritual nature to reality that might enlighten one in some way. And then I guess I don't know. I'm open to that, but presumably that would just lead to I don't know, a deeper compassion for the environment, or maybe you'd find out actually trees aren't conscious, and then you change your mind. So, but yeah, I guess is there a possible bridge between forms of consciousness? So I'm starting to get the same questions again. I don't know what's happened here. Is this? I'll just keep going through them. Maybe they're mixing up the order of the questions or something. Anyway, Lucy Hammersley says, "What does all this say about the fundamental nature of the individual?" Oh, for you to. Oh, we've done that as well. Have I gone? I must have gone back. So I don't know what's happening, that some of the same questions keep coming up. Question from Richard Hawke. You're right to mention Teilhard de Chardin, very interesting thinker, and his ideas of the noosphere of our times. It directs us towards the moral element you skipped over, but I think is central to your thesis, and all the more tricky as it's too immaterial for the physical sciences, even more than consciousness, and yet probably is a real thing. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree that there are deep difficulties. So I think there are a number of puzzling phenomena that are hard to fit into the scientific worldview. Consciousness is one of them. Free will, facts about value, abstract objects like numbers and sets. I'd say they're the four big ones. I think why consciousness is the most interesting is that it's so hard to deny. You know, with all these other things, it's at least an option. I was saying this to Claudia and Andrew. It's at least an option to deny the reality of the phenomenon. Maybe we're not really free in the way we think we are. Maybe value is just our subjective projections of our subjective feelings. I'm not saying those views are correct, but there's at least an option. Maybe mathematics is a sort of useful fiction. It's so hard, though, to have the illusionist view that we just discussed, that nobody's ever felt pain. So I think that's why, I mean, consciousness is the most important, the one I tend to focus on. And I think that's the one that's really kind of starting to persuade people because it's so difficult to deny its existence. So I sort of think that's the one that's kind of going to change things. But actually, I mean, I do believe in all of these things. I do believe in, I am inclined to believe in moral value and abstract objects and free will. So, and I appreciate that these need to be accommodated too, and I hope to talk about that in future work. Is conscious? Oh, I mean, I do have a recent paper on panpsychism and free will. It's an academic paper. It should be published. Is consciousness possible in lifeless objects? Can consciousness be free-flowing without connection? Yeah, so I mean, certainly so panpsychism doesn't literally mean everything is conscious. The basic idea is the fundamental building blocks of reality are conscious, maybe the particles or maybe universe-wide fields. It doesn't literally mean every random collection of particles is conscious. Doesn't mean rocks and socks and tables and chairs are conscious. So it doesn't mean this table is conscious. It means that it's made up of things that are conscious, have very simple forms of consciousness. But still, yeah, it does mean consciousness goes beyond the animate realm, at least in the ordinary way we think about that. Question from Henry Ford: is there spooky action of entanglement in any panpsychist theories? Well, I mean, entanglement is one of our most confirmed scientific, well-confirmed scientific findings. You know, I mean, it's a absolute. So I talk about this a little bit in the book, in the sense that when discussing this reductionist view to try and reductionist interpretation of panpsychism, this pressure to think we have to reduce human consciousness to particle consciousness, you know, in line with a sort of materialist reduction, but a sort of expansive materialist reduction. But I do say, well, why are we doing this? Why are we having a kind of reductionist picture when we know that there are some wholes that are not reducible to their parts, where we have quantum entanglement? You know, you have pairs of particles that behave as a whole in a way that's not reducible to facts about their parts. So I think it's an important fact, an important empirical fact to inform our theorizing. Although the other thing about entanglement is you can't communicate with it. You can't send a signal with it. So that might limit what you can deduce from that in certain ways. From Geely, you sound like a dual aspect theorist, are you? Probably. It depends what you mean by a dual aspect theorist. Yeah, and if you want to think of that, I mean, I want to emphasize how non-dualistic this is. In a sense, there's just consciousness. And physics tells us how consciousness behaves. You know, mass and charge are just these simple forms of consciousness. Physics tells us what they do, but they're just simple forms of consciousness. But if you want to think, in a sense, it's dual aspect, that there's the quantitative aspect, the behavioral aspect that physics describes, and the intrinsic nature aspect that underlies that. Thank you. From David Leach. Sorry, 38 left. I'll try and get through as many as I can. Do you think what is it like? I should probably speed up, shouldn't I? Do you think what is like to be the cosmic mind might be easier to imagine than what is like to be? I've forgotten. I need to read these out more clearly, don't I? Sorry if I've been just reading them out to myself. Do you think that the what it's like to be the cosmic mind may be easier to imagine than what it's like to be micro subjects like quarks? And if so, can extraordinary human experience, such as mystical experiences, help us out here, even if they should not be taken at face value? But on cosmopsychism, there's no strong prima facie reason supposing the delusions either. Yeah, that's very interesting. I suppose you might think something more holistic, more sophisticated might be more easy to imagine, although still, I don't know, imagining what it's like to be the universe and have such incredibly complex experience might be just as difficult as thinking what it's like to be a particle Philosopher Miri al-Bahari, who defends a kind of Hindu-inspired theory. And it's interesting. I come from analytic philosophy, which is a very kind of dry, rigorous, scientific view. But what's emerged out of it in more recent times are panpsychism and Miri al-Bahari defends a kind of Vedantic view, but in the tradition of analytic philosophy, this very dry, rigorous way, justifying the epistemological, um, taking meditation experiences epistemologically seriously. And anyway, the reason I'm raising this is she tries to say this whole idea of the universe being conscious doesn't really make coherent sense when you think it through. She prefers to think that the universal consciousness is sort of beyond matter. But yeah, I'm inclined to think if you do think there are these universe-wide fields, and you do take mystical experiences seriously, then you might think that that reveals something about the intrinsic nature of these fields, and that's a conclusion Eddington drew as well, actually. So there is, this is fundamentally a way of bringing together just what mundane facts of what we know about ourselves from the inside together with science. If you do believe in more mystical states of consciousness, then you could apply the same approach to bring those in, such that they're not in tension with the contemporary scientific story. I mean, that's definitely a possibility. Do intrinsic properties actually exist? Isn't everything relationship? Doesn't this fit with quantum field theory or electromagnetic field theory? Surely calling intrinsic properties consciousness is a form of identity theory. How can intrinsic properties be consciousness, i.e. experience? So I think this was Angus Nisbet. So I think I've already talked about that a bit, about why I think there need to be intrinsic properties. How can intrinsic properties be consciousness? Well, I suppose I think that intrinsic consciousness properties are a very good candidate for intrinsic properties. So the problem with things like mass as it's defined by physics is it's always defined in terms of something else. I think like negative charge is defined in terms of positive charge. Everything's defined in terms of something else. But if you think about a feeling, I think a feeling of pain is not defined in terms of something else. It's just defined in terms of how it feels, the intrinsic character. So I think these are very good candidates. But I think the view I'm describing is perfectly consistent with quantum field theory or electromagnetic field theory. Suppose you just say that you're talking about the intrinsic nature of these fields. I'm not saying it's entailed by these theories at all, but it's completely consistent with them. I hope. I haven't heard a reason why not. Okay, Michael Lingard, is universal consciousness reflecting the total information field? This question came to me as I cannot accept the Big Bang theory. What was there before the Big Bang? If information is the fundamental field, as I mentioned in my book Connection, cycles of all information, the all matter and energy, then back again. Einstein gives us E equals mc squared. I would like to offer E equals ec squared, that matter can be converted to energy and energy to information. Big Bang theory. Well, so we're getting into cosmological. Need to explain why there's something rather than nothing. I think panpsychism. It's not obvious to me how it's sort of neutral on these questions. It's just trying to accommodate the mundane reality of consciousness in the first instance. Pleasure, pain, visual experiences. Doesn't necessarily solve all philosophical difficulties, including, for example, these cosmological issues of why does the universe exist at all. Question from Tuvi Orbach. How do you explain near-death experience in which EEG or ECG are flat, not exists, but the person can experience and know how of what happened both in the operation room and even far away? Yeah, good question. It's not something I've looked into a great deal. I suppose this is going to be. I think these probably as problematic for a panpsychist as for a materialist. So maybe you think these offer evidence for dualism over panpsychism. You might think if you take these things seriously. Although I still think on a dualist view, it's difficult to explain how. I'd love to, a lot of these debates are over, the empirical evidence, the veracity of statements and these things. What I find less of is actually, maybe someone can let me know about this, a detailed working out of the theory that's supposed to, how does the immaterial mind perceive the things when it's outside of the body? Presumably when it's in the body, it uses the sense organs. How does, what is the mechanic, what is the spelled out theory that the immaterial mind has the capacity to see objects when it's outside the body? I don't know. For me, it's not, I'm more of a philosopher. I kind of want to know the theory, and I often find there's discussions of near-death experiences are talking about the evidence, but not I just want to hear the details of how the theory is supposed to work. And I suppose it's like coming back to Bayesian. If you don't know about Bayes' theorem, you should get into Bayes. Like that, on the one hand is the evidence, but on the other hand is the prior probability. And before persuaded by evidence, I want the prior probability up a bit. And I suppose to get the prior probability up, I need the details of theory. And I never seem to get the details of theory. I'm sure that's probably going to annoy everyone what I've just said then. But anyways, maybe someone could tell me where the details have been filled out. How about consciousness is just there? It's up to each being. This is from Diane Skidmore. It's up to each being, tree, fish, human, whatever, wherever we tune in, whether we tune in or not. I don't think humans any more than enlightened conscious than other beings. For example, it would be wonderful to see recently that whales are altruistic. Do you think a better question would be, how does it work rather than what it is? Yeah, it's interesting. Consciousness is, I think maybe this might be part of the ambiguity of the word consciousness. I think maybe using it in a little bit of a different way to me, that it's something we tune into or not, like it's some kind, I think you're thinking of maybe some kind of transcendent conscious reality. Whereas, as I say, by consciousness, I just mean experience, like mundane experiences like pain and pleasure and but yeah, I suppose, well, look, there are different things one might be interested in, and what I'm interested in, what I work on, is not the only interesting question. I'm interested in, how do we make sense of experience of whatever kind, even just itches? I think our current scientific worldview is inconsistent with the existence of itches. Something as mundane as an itch. So that's messed up. We need to change our worldview so that it can accommodate itches. Okay, and that's not going to solve all the problems. We still haven't explained why the universe exists. There's going to be lots of big questions, but at least let's get it consistent with the uncontroversial reality of itches, because that's obviously a problem with our worldview if it's inconsistent with any experience whatsoever, which I believe it is, which is of course controversial. Joe Scarrott. What if the idea of intrinsic nature is no more than a wishful construction? Why do you think that an entity needs some more fundamental definition than a categorization of its features, quality, and modes of interaction? Okay, well, I think I've already spoken on this. Well, qualities, I'm not sure about qualities. The claim is there must be more than, the claim intrinsic nature would be defined as more than what can be captured in a mathematical causal vocabulary. But yeah, it's a good question. Why think there is more to an electron than what it does? Maybe once you know what the electron does, you know everything there is to know about what it is. My colleague Stephen Mumford at Durham University has this view. He's a very famous proponent of it. So yeah, you need to be arguments. I've tried to say there are arguments that we really can't make intelligible sense of reality without intrinsic natures. And also, but I think if you postulate intrinsic, we know consciousness exists. We have to fit it into the world somehow. I think if we postulate intrinsic natures, we can adopt this theory I've been outlining, which manages to integrate consciousness into our worldview in a way that avoids the deep difficulties with the other options. So I think that in itself gives us a reason to postulate intrinsic natures, even if the denial of intrinsic natures is not, strictly speaking, incoherent. I guess we're out of time. Should I answer one more question?
Yeah, just one more.
Sorry, there's 42 left. I'm so sorry. Brian Sweeney. Hi, Philip. Hi, Brian. Stephen Artridge. Okay, so this will have to be the last question. In your best case future, so I think we've answered all the ones up to 8:55, so that's not too bad. In your best case future, will we ever point to just one man or one woman as responsible for an entire reboot of matter's relationship to mind? in the way that physics has with Einstein when it comes to replacing mechanistic classic physics in the macro? If so, it will be if it matters if they are not a scientist with a capital S. Jesus said, I am the all came forth from me, and the all attained to me. Cleave a piece of wood, I am there. Raise up a stone, and you will find me there. The Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, very cool, very cool. A lot of the Gnostic Gospels not so inspired by, but Gnostic Gospel is very interesting. And you're right, it does seem to have kind of pantheistic, panpsychist connotations. Yeah, I suppose I think that has there been one person who's ever made a big difference? I suppose I think Russell and Eddington and Whitehead. People always tell me off for, these discussions in the 20s was so interesting, and it had precedent. It had precedent in Schopenhauer, has a lot of precedent. I'm sure there must be lots of precedent in Eastern philosophy that some people are exploring right now. But I mean, I think that was the breakthrough really in the 1920s, and I just think the latter half of the 20th century was just very dogmatic and ideological, a sort of science. I think we're going through a phase of history where we're so blown away by the success of physical science that people are inclined to think that's all it is, that's all, and that leads to a nice sense of security. People talk about religion as a crutch, but I think people get security from this sense that science is the way to truth. We don't have all the answers, but we know that this is the way, and so it's hard to break out of that. And I believe, in the 1920s, we already have the solution, but it's a cultural thing. And this is why with this, I think what you need to do is the fiddly arguments never convince anyone, right? The arguments or evidence, the evidence should convince people, but it's the big picture, it's the narrative. So this is why in the Galileo's error book, I try to get a narrative, because I think people are just driven by this idea of, look at the success of science. I don't care about your philosophical arguments. Look at the success of science. So I'm giving an alternative narrative. Yes, science has been so successful, but this is an alternative way of understanding why it's been so successful, because it was aimed at a quite limited project that wasn't supposed to be dealing with consciousness. And so, it's that alternative narrative that I hope will open people up to the new approach. I really think we need to turn to, and I think it's pretty inevitable, because I think the reality of consciousness is so hard to deny, and its inconsistency with the materialist worldview is pretty straightforward. So things are changing fast, and I'm quite hopeful, and it's all very exciting. So yeah, stick around and join the fight, join the revolution.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Philip. That was super interesting. And we are all clapping virtually.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. Thank you as well.
I take away a number of things. One of the things that I take away is, you mentioned the itch, such a fundamental thing, such a thing that everybody experiences and we can't explain. Evidence is an explanation for people, and a lot of people who have had mystical experiences, paranormal experiences, for them, that is evidence, that is absolute evidence. And what I take away also, above all, is how limited we are, how limited our minds are in front of these very, very big questions, and how humble we need to be when we are facing these very big questions. So thank you very much indeed, Philip. Thank you, everybody around.